The global arms trade is a moral minefield, and I'd say maybe that's an understatement. And South Africa is finding this out firsthand. The country has reportedly, since early this year, blocked sales of arms to countries including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Pretoria is insisting on export conditions that include allowing South African inspectors to visit importers' facilities to ensure compliance. Countries like Saudi Arabia are reportedly not keen on the inspections as they view them as a violation of their sovereignty. Add to the complication that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are actually involved in a war in Yemen, and the possibility that South African manufactured weapons have featured in that conflict and in violations of rights cannot be ruled out. Let's bring in Terry Crawford-Brown now of the organization World Beyond War to weigh in on this. So you've been engaged in the lobbying and activism around the arms industry for over 2 decades, Mr. Crawford-Brown. What's your understanding of where things stand now in terms of exports to these countries and the whole permits situation?
Yes, for the last 20 years, the National Conventional Arms Control Committee has been obliged to apply the stipulations that South Africa will not export armaments to countries that abuse human rights or to regions in conflict. And sadly, for the last 2 decades, those stipulations have been ignored. We have a new committee since earlier this year that is finally applying those stipulations. The idea that South Africa, given our history, is complicit in human rights abuses and the humanitarian disaster in Yemen really has been shameful. And it is overdue that we actually apply the law.
So not exporting to countries like Saudi Arabia, is that a good or a bad thing? And also, does it say that we're finally finding our moral conscience?
We should not have been exporting to Saudi Arabia since the beginning of our transition to constitutional democracy because of its human rights abuses. The idea, however, that it is a lucrative business is refuted by the fact that Donnell has been losing billions upon billions of rand over the last 20 years. The arms industry is a highly subsidized industry. It's also a capital-intensive industry. We're continually told it creates jobs, but in fact it's a capital-intensive industry. And you could create more jobs and better paying jobs in almost any other industry, for instance, sustainable energy, solar or wind energy, than in exporting weapons to Saudi Arabia or UAE for use in Yemen and the disaster in Yemen. It's an industry that South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, should not be in.
Is it your sense, though, Mr. Crawford-Brown, that this is a position that the government, through the Conventional Arms Control Committee, has taken a principled position that says this is it, we are going to start implementing our approach and the conditions and policies that we have? Or is it a temporary snag that perhaps people in your position should not be celebrating, the air will be cleared around this issue of these inspections and exports will resume?
Yeah, we hear that it's a temporary thing in terms of the end-user certificate. I'm afraid end-user certificates have a notorious history. They really are totally ineffective. And so the argument that, oh, we are impinging on Saudi or UAE sovereignty is simply eyewash. We should not be exporting to Saudi Arabia or UAE to begin with.
All right, lastly, there's a particular angle that has to do with Rheinmetall Denel and its operation from Makassar in the Western Cape there that is of concern to you in particular, that you want to bring attention to. Last year, we saw that explosion at that factory there at Rheinmetall Denel, and there were those, fatalities that occurred during that explosion. What concerns you about this operation?
Rheinmetall deliberately locates its production in countries like South Africa in order to bypass German export regulations. And exports to Saudi Arabia are hugely contentious post the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in October last year. So they deliberately try to bypass those German export regulations. And about 85% of their production are, in fact, for export to the Middle East, and particularly to Saudi Arabia and UAE.
All right, thank you so much for that, Mr. Terry Crawford Brown, joining me from our Cape Town studios. We've been talking about this situation, about whether or not South Africa is actually exporting armaments to countries such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who are involved in some conflicts.